The horror from beneath the earth. Frank was an amateur gambler. Every morning he would go to the bar and spend his time there until late in the evening playing cards with others. He played only for money all the time and always won. But one day a gambler, Hammond, sat down to play cards with him. Frank had no idea that the greediest man in the bar had sat down to play cards with him. The deal was to play for money again. But during the game, Frank realized that he was losing. And of course, he lost his money to Hammond. "That's it, you lost," said to Frank Hammond. However, the latter replied, "I won." So he decided to get even, but he lost a lot of money again. And so it was the third time. Hammond took Frank's money and wouldn't give it back. Then Frank said he would come again the next day and play cards until the very end, until Hammond gave up. Hammond agreed. The next day Frank and Hammond started the game. The radio and television were on in the bar. But nothing distracted them from the game. Meanwhile, there was an accident at the construction site. A Caesarea with gasoline exploded. No one was killed, but there was a deep hole in the ground. Construction workers went down into it to see how deep it was. The depth of the hole turned out to be 150 pounds. As the builders began to climb up, they heard strange noises below. It was as if something was rising from the depths. They rushed up quickly and began to fill in the hole. The news of the explosion at the construction site was broadcast on the radio in the bar, and the television showed footage of the accident site and the deep hole in the ground. But when the strange noises in the depths began to be broadcast, Hammond turned off both the TV and the radio, and continued to play with Frank. In this game, Frank cheated and stole some of his money from Hammond. Then he left the bar. At night, Frank's phone rang. It was a call from Hammond. He demanded that Frank give him his money back. Frank hung up. But it took him all night to get to sleep. The phone rang 2 more times, but he no longer answered it. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the doorbell rang. Frank opened the door in his sleep without even asking who was there. Hammond burst in with his fists. He yelled at Frank, demanding his money back. But Frank claimed he hadn't taken the money. Said someone else from the bar could have taken it. Hammond believed him and left. Frank slept for another hour. The next morning all the channels were broadcasting that giant mutant worms had begun to crawl out of the ground, which might have been awakened by the explosion at the construction site. The first victims of the worms were the construction workers. Frank could not believe such nonsense. But people were strictly forbidden to leave their homes. And Frank saw one of the worms in his window. It was something as big as a high-rise. A horrible worm was crawling under the window. The worms were crawling out of the ground everywhere, devouring everyone in their path, destroying houses and everything around them. They were bombed by the military, but to no avail. They simply could not be destroyed. Soon Frank himself was without a home. And Hammond kept hounding him, demanding his money back. After all, he had figured him out. Frank went to his 2 friends, John and Michael. They took their guns and went worm hunting. With them, they brought a professional hunter, a former scientist from Bethina. They searched for worms in the place where they found the most worms, the dried-up lake. On their way to the lake, they saw a pile of mangled human bodies and worm tracks. They saw a lot of holes in the ground. They stopped near a barn. Suddenly Hammond and 2 men approached them. The men were armed. Hammond again demanded that Frank give him his money back, and the 2 men threatened them that they would shoot them. Frank tossed Hammond his wallet and told him he could have all the money, just to leave him alone. Hammond took the wallet for himself, and then he jumped on Frank and started beating him. But Michael, John, and the scientist tried to stand up for their friend and started beating Hammond. The 2 men couldn't stand it and wanted to shoot them. But then 2 giant worms crawled out of the ground and dragged them both underground. The friends helped Frank fight off Hammond and ran, but they punched Hammond in the face and threw him to the worms. They ran up to the bridge over the river, and John ran into the barn and started looking there for some weapons. He found gasoline. Meanwhile, Hammond was already on the bridge and fighting with the others. One of the worms caught up with them, and was moving toward the bridge. The scientist opened fire on the worm, and it disappeared underground. John wanted to pour gasoline on the worm, and set it on fire. Suddenly he saw that Hammond wanted to kill Frank. He ran up to him, doused Hammond with gasoline, then lit him on fire with a lighter, and he burst into flames. Frank managed to get away from him. And Michael threw a knife at Hammond. And Hammond flipped off the bridge into the water. When they looked down from the bridge, they saw that Hammond was out of sight and steam was coming out of the water. Suddenly they heard something and looked from the other side of the bridge and saw Frank, who was sailing away in a boat. "You chickened out," they thought. They didn't wait for him to come to his senses and come back, but went to the lake. When they got to the right place, they found a hospital. John went to see if anyone was alive in the hospital. When he got there, he saw that the hospital was all ruined, that there was not a soul and blood on the walls. He prepared his shotgun in case a worm appeared and went forward. When he entered the ruined room, he found two beds, one with a mangled corpse on it, the other with a man who was trying to say something but couldn't. He wanted John to kill him, but John did not understand what he wanted. Suddenly the man's body seemed to explode, and giant worm larvae began to crawl on the bed. It turned out that the worms had laid their eggs in some people. John immediately destroyed the maggots with a shotgun and walked back out of the hospital. He didn't want to know what else was in it. Meanwhile, Michael and the scientist shot at the two worms. But the worms were not destroyed this way. Soon John joined them. He wouldn't even tell them about the hospital. The worms disappeared underground, and the men did not know what to do next, to wait or to leave. Suddenly the ground shook and the scientist rolled over to the bottom of the dried-up lake. He was already in the mouth of the worm, which immediately came out of the ground. The friends began to shoot at the worm, but it had already swallowed the scientist and disappeared again under the ground. They could not recover from the shock for a long time, but then they hurried to get away from there. When they were well away from the lake, they saw a huge factory. They prepared their rifles and went inside. There was no destruction inside. They got quietly to the middle of the plant. Suddenly they heard footsteps behind them. Before they knew it, a rope was around their necks and someone was strangling them until they lost consciousness. They woke up tied up in a room. Suddenly they saw Hammond coming toward them. He told them that when he fell into the water, the fire went out and the knife bounced off, and he made it to shore. And then he told them that he wanted to catch one of the worms and get $1 million for it. "These mutants must be destroyed. You won't get anything," they told him. But he wouldn't even listen to them, and went off somewhere. He followed the huge nets. Suddenly John and Michael heard the ground shake and rumble. A giant worm was coming out of the floor. They got to their feet and tried to run away. Suddenly Hammond ran in and threw a net over the worm. But the worm tore them apart and rushed after Hammond. He wanted to climb up the ladder, but the worm caught up with him. Hammond fell off the ladder and flew straight into the worm's mouth. Michael and John were able to untie themselves, and began looking for a way out of the plant. There was only one way out. They had to climb the ladder to the top and jump down. They found one shotgun, which was low on ammunition, and started looking for a ladder. Meanwhile, the worm was chasing them. It managed to catch up to them, but John opened fire on it. He shot the worm, acid poured from the wound and Hammond fell out, who was covered in meat and blood. He fell down, but then suddenly got up, silently picked up the pitchfork hanging on the wall, and just as silently chased after the men. The worm continued chasing after them. Hammond was catching up with the men, crumbling from the acid. But he didn't give up, he was just furious and wanted to pierce them with his pitchfork. John and Michael saw the ladder and climbed up, Hammond after them, and the worm after him. John kicked the pitchfork and Hammond dropped it, but kept climbing after them. John kicked him again, and Hammond flew into the worm's mouth. They managed to climb up, and they jumped down when the worm had already caught up with them. But the worm outwitted them, and they fell right into its mouth. But the two men who had the dynamite saw it all. The worm attacked them as well, but they managed to set fire to the rope of dynamite. At this time, Frank, who decided to come back after all, rushed toward them. The worm managed to swallow the two men, but the dynamite exploded inside him. The worm's head exploded, and its body collapsed to the ground. Frank, just at that moment, came to the spot. He knew that the rest of the worms would be finished off by the military. But his conscience tormented him, that he had chickened out and survived, and his friends were dead. He looked at the dead worm and whispered one phrase, "I lost."